Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. You might remember that we made a mohawk mask mold in a recent video series, which you can find on Patreon. This time I'm going to show you how to cast a plaster copy of your sculpture within such a mold. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see the full video, you can join my Patreon page. Here on the table is the materials that we'll be using when making this cast, and working with plaster in general. First thing is plaster, of course. Plaster powder mixed with water creates the material we'll be making our casting out of. Any plaster made for casting or mold making is going to work just fine here. Burlap fiber is used for reinforcement for the plaster, sort of like rebar in concrete. It allows us to use less plaster, get a lighter cast, yet a stronger casting overall. Before I start, I always cut a variety of sizes so I don't have to stress cutting while plaster is setting up. To keep the mold from laying on its side, you can see that I'm having to use some leftover 2x4s to keep it upright. Now, this could have been solved by making a better mold. This particular issue of your mold falling over and not sitting upright on its own is not something that I have mastered completely during the mold making process just yet. Maybe I'll get to it eventually. The hole at the end of the mohawk cut, where the wooden dowel was stuck into the sculpture and the mold built around it, ensures that the silicone now can't rip, since a hole can withstand tremendous amount of force. That's great when opening the mold, but does mean that there is a hole straight through the mold which material can pour through. To fix this issue, we must simply plug the hole using water-based clay. There's no doubt that it's massively important to mix a good ball of plaster in order to create a good cast. Luckily, there's only one way which I mix plaster, which yields great results every time. First, fill your bowl with about 1/3 of water. Any more water and the bowl could easily overflow once we start adding the plaster powder. Depending on the amount of plaster you need and the size of your bowl, you'll get a feel for how much you need to mix. But any more water than 1/3 tends to go sideways on you. Always go water first. Cold water slows the setting time down and warm water speeds up the setting time. Plaster powder is then sifted into the bowl slowly. I try to sift it in a way that breaks up any lumps of plaster and has loose powder falling into my water. Keep going, making sure that the plaster powder is spread evenly throughout the bowl and not as a mountain in the middle of the bowl. When the plaster powder reaches the surface level, ideally slightly above the surface level actually, try to make a very shallow island of plaster powder. Too tall of a powder island and the water won't soak into the powder, giving you a much harder time mixing the plaster later. Now we wait for around 1 to 2 minutes, letting the water soak into the plaster completely. You shouldn't mix until your powder turns completely gray. Then you can mix the plaster with a metal spatula. The more you mix, the more bubbles you introduce and the faster the plaster will set up. Agitating the plaster mixture more makes it set up faster, so more mixing makes it set up faster. And the reason we take such a good care during the entire process is to make sure that we don't have to mix very much, giving us the best possible plaster mix we could possibly get. The first step when it comes to getting plaster into the mold and creating the actual casting is to do a splash coat. A splash coat is meant to cover the surface sufficiently, capture all the details, and be thin enough to minimize the overall weight of the casting itself. So while we'd like it to be thin, we do want it to be of even thickness, which is tricky since the inside surface of the mold isn't even at all. In some places, an even thickness is impossible since the depths are too great. If you've gotten this far into the video and you're still not subscribed, what are you doing? Hit that subscribe button and the bell to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. I do appreciate the support. The splash coat is going to have burlap laid in behind it. This means we can't let this layer of plaster be transparent at all. It needs to be of a solid color. A dead giveaway that we need more thickness is when we can see the silicone through the thin plaster. This is too thin, obviously, and we should therefore add more plaster on top. When the splash coat is thick enough so that there are no spots where the silicone is visible through the plaster, we should be good, and the splash coat is thick enough and is going to do what we need it to do. Another key point is that this splash coat does become the surface of our casting eventually. This means, of course, that we can't have any defects, and while defects certainly can be repaired later once the plaster cast is removed from the mold, it is much better and more time-saving if we do a good job on our splash coat, and therefore have less repairs to make. To apply the plaster inside the mold, I like to pour some plaster into the mold, giving me a little reservoir to grab plaster from and pull around inside the mold. This is sort of just a speed thing, makes life a little bit easier. If the plaster is mixed properly, its consistency should be such that it stays in place at a pretty decent thickness when brushed around. If your plaster is too thin, then this can't happen and the plaster will separate from the silicone surface like oil on water, or it will become too thin as it pools towards the bottom of your mold. Clean up the plaster as you go. The plaster is easiest to clean cleanly, meaning without damaging the casting itself, while it's still wet and movable. Before it sets up, in other words. Any plaster that gets over the edge of our mold should be cleaned off using a spatula or your fingers. So what is burlap? Burlap is an open weave fabric that's cheap and flexible. It adds strength to the plaster by making a layer that binds itself together, keeping the plaster from sort of shattering if it's dropped. It will add strength, but also keep the plaster very light. It's essentially like fiberglass in epoxy, or polyurethane, or rebar in concrete, for example. It keeps the construction lighter than it otherwise would be, and helps it get to a much greater level of strength. You could conceivably use any fabric for this task, I imagine, but burlap is both cheap, thin, light, and the plaster soaks into it rather easily, and it folds in both directions, making it ideal for our task here. Burlap is very straightforward to work with. First, brush a bit of plaster onto the inside of the casting itself. This will help the burlap lay down on the surface without any air bubbles between splash coat and the burlap itself. The burlap can then be dipped into a bowl of liquid plaster and allowed to be soaked. I will usually use my hands for this task and completely soak the burlap in the plaster, then squeeze out most of the plaster, squeegee it out of the burlap using my hands. Depending on the amount of plaster that the burlap absorbs, I might or might not do the squeegee step. Sometimes I'll only let the side of the burlap that's going to be face down inside the mold get plaster on it. It really depends, and I'm not so sure the results are all that different, no matter which way you choose to go about it. I covered the entire inside surface with at least 2 layers of burlap. I tried to make sure that every single piece of burlap that's laid down gets overlapped by the next one, and that it overlaps the one that was laid down previous to it as well. Except for the first one, of course. I keep especially track of this once I get to the second layer. When there is no layer of burlap inside the mold when you begin, you can sort of see where you've laid down burlap already. If you can't see this, you're probably using too much plaster in your burlap and making a bit of a mess of things, honestly. The second layer is significantly harder to see, however, since now the entire inside surface is already covered with burlap texture. Keeping careful track of where you've been therefore becomes paramount. The 2 layers of burlap is applied without break in between to make sure that they stick really well to each other. Since the fragile part of the process is sort of over with at this point, we really don't need to concern ourselves too greatly over the fact that we don't wait in between layers for them to set up. Once the splash coat is set up, we're fairly safe to just keep working. Though you do have to be a little bit careful because you can punch through or crack the splash coat unless you work with a somewhat of a light touch. There's no way, of course, for me to describe exactly how light or heavy of a touch you need. You're just going to have to do it yourself and experience it. That's it for part 1. We'll finish off the casting and open the mold in part 2, which will come out on YouTube later. Make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications so you don't miss it. If you're interested in learning more about casting and mold making, and even sculpture, hop over to my Patreon page and I'm sure you will find something of interest to you there. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, remember to hit the like button. And I also hope you learned something that you can take with you into your own practice. Until next time, stay creative.